Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal. I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. I want to talk today about a famous dialogue by Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. The title of the dialogue is Meno, and it concerns a conversation between Socrates and a character named Meno. For those who aren't familiar with the Platonic dialogues, Socrates in Plato's dialogues is usually Plato's mouthpiece, the voice of Plato's position, and then other possible positions on a particular philosophical issue are espoused by other people who dialogue with Socrates in the course of the conversation. At any rate, in the Meno, we are faced with a discussion between Socrates and Meno about the question, what is virtue? And the second question also, can virtue be taught? What is virtue and can virtue be taught? So two questions drive the dialogue. And Meno offers several different possible answers to the question, what is virtue? Ultimately, at the end of the dialogue, they never really resolve the question, what is virtue? And they also struggle to answer the question, can virtue be taught? My own views are that virtue can't be taught in an academic sense through lectures in a classroom. Perhaps a lecturer could give a student the tools of virtue, but virtue cannot really be taught, I don't think, in the sense in which it can be absorbed by means of first personal practice. At any rate, in the course of the dialogue, Socrates and Meno settle upon the notion that virtue is a kind of knowledge. And so in the middle of the dialogue, a famous scene occurs. This scene is somewhat, I guess you could say, removable from the topics of the dialogue as a whole. And the famous scene is when a slave boy enters and solves a geometry problem. Socrates, noticing that the slave boy enters, uses the slave boy as an example for his theory of knowledge. And it goes as follows. Socrates initially asks the slave boy to solve a geometry problem that involves finding the area of a square that is twice the size and area of an initial square. So find a second square that is twice the size and area of an initial square. And the slave boy at first is unable to solve the problem. But then by means of Socratic questioning, he eventually solves it. Now, there are several possible answers for how this slave boy, who clearly is unable to solve the problem at the beginning of the questioning and has not had geometric training, there are several possible answers to how he solves the problem and what's going on in this famous dialogue scene. So one possible answer is that Socrates is feeding him leading questions. I like to be charitable as a reader of Plato and to think that Socrates is not feeding him leading questions. And for that reason, I like to go ahead and give Socrates the benefit of the doubt in this part of the dialogue and assume that the slave boy is in fact arriving at this knowledge on his own. Otherwise, the philosophical principle kind of breaks down. Another possible answer to how the slave boy got this knowledge, how he solves the geometry problem, is the answer that would first come to my mind, and that is that the slave boy in fact is utilizing knowledge that he had previously acquired at earlier times in his life, maybe basic knowledge of numbers, basic knowledge of shapes, and now he is putting that knowledge together in a new way, a new pattern, if you will, in solving this geometry problem that Socrates poses for him. A third potential response is to say, as Socrates himself says in the course of the dialogue, so this is Socrates' response, is to say that the slave boy, in fact, did not acquire his knowledge of the geometry problem in this life. Now, Socrates posits as an explanation for how the slave boy solves the geometry problem that the slave boy's soul had pre-bodily existence. And this is the famous Platonic recollection theory of knowledge, or the recollection doctrine of knowledge. Prior to this life, the slave boy's soul was in communion with the forms, so to speak, in the realm of the forms. The forms are a famous Platonic concept, which I explain to my students at further length in classes. But The forms then were directly accessible to the soul of the slave boy in a pre-bodily existence. And then when the slave boy's soul was embodied, it was captured, so to speak, in the body. And the body, Plato is famously opposed to the ills of the body. The body then, in some way, trapped the soul of the slave boy, causing the soul of the slave boy to cease to know what it once knew. So access was lost to the knowledge of the forms, including knowledge of geometrical forms, when the slave boy's soul became embodied. And the learning process for Socrates, at least as a mouthpiece of Plato in this dialogue, is just a matter of recollecting what we once knew, recollecting knowledge that we lost when our bodies became embodied, our souls became embodied in our bodies after this pre-bodily existence period ended. So it's a fascinating theory. It's very different than anything I would have ever come up with, and as a Christian philosopher, I don't believe in the pre-bodily existence of the soul. I believe that the soul is given to us by God following conception. But at the same time, I think it is a fascinating view that Socrates offers, and one that opens up a number of interesting philosophical questions about the nature of the forms and the possibilities and extent and scope of the soul's knowledge.